On today's show, now that Summer League is in the books, I thought it was the right time to look at some big picture topics when it comes to the Bucks. Are the Bucks being overlooked in the East? And what is the benefit of bringing back familiar faces rather than significant change? Because some of the contenders keep flipping big names and the Bucks just keep bringing them back. Does that mean that we get bored of the same players? And is that fair? Also, Adrian Griffin, there's a lot of talk about how the defense is going to change. Did it really need to change? This was a really good defensive team. So big picture topics today on Locked On Bucks. Let's get into
it. You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bucks. My name's Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show Monday to Friday, and also find my work over at ESPN. And alongside me from the Bucks Radio Network, Justin Garcia is back for the first time in a little while. Frank, we had some games and Frank was in there. We were doing the post-game stuff for Summer League. By the way, if you wanted to catch up with any of our thoughts from Summer League, go back and listen to the shows. Lots of talk about Andre Jackson Jr., Chris Livingston, a little bit of AJ Green in there, and the rest of the Summer League Bucks. But that's in the rear vision mirror. We thank everyone for making Locked On Bucks your first watch or first listen of every single weekday right through the offseason. We appreciate the support and the engagement and giving us ideas what to talk about on the show. If you haven't done so yet, subscribe, drop a like, a comment, review, rate, do all those things that podcasts like this one love you to do. It's free to do, and it does help us get new viewers and continues to boost the show. So we really appreciate it. Before we get into it tonight, Justin, I just want to plug an event this Friday, July 21, at the Cooperage. I believe that's how it's said. Doors open at 6:30. 7:30, there is going to be a watch party for Game 6 of the 2021 NBA Finals. And look, a pretty memorable game, I would say, for most Bucks fans. And now that Summer League's not there, you might be craving some Bucks basketball and some vintage Giannis and Chris Middleton and all the familiar faces. So go down to the Cooperage on Friday night. It's free to get in there. Hang out with Bucks fans and have a good time. What else would you want to do on a Friday night? I would be there if I was in Milwaukee, Justin. Go fucking relive Game 6.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to get there, and if we could draw a couple hundred people out just to listen to us talk, I would assume could probably get close to 1,000 to relive Game 6 of the finals. And you should point out that we're obviously in that point of the year now where we've seen it for a couple of weeks now that this is always going to be the anniversary of Game 7 against Brooklyn, and this is when Chris scored 40. In the conference finals. And just a couple of days ago, it was the anniversary Chris scoring 40 in Game 4 of the NBA Finals. But I think the nice part about the NBA calendar that year is that, this is going to happen and we'll have these anniversaries basically in the off season. And it's not like as the season is going on that it's at least something to eat up the time of, oh yeah, remember the weird year where everything was pushed back and that's when the Bucks won the finals. So it was 2 years ago this day, and we're 2 months into the off season.
Terrible times for the world, but for that daily podcast and the real shortened off season into the Olympics was pretty nice because we are in the dead period of the off season. But speaking of the 2021 finals and the two teams that were competing, the Milwaukee Bucks, Phoenix Suns, I saw a tweet today that said that from the 2021 finals, the only two players on the Phoenix roster that are still there, Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton. And it's a surprise to everyone that DeAndre Ayton is still there as well, which made me think about the idea of consistency versus change when it comes to personnel on a contending roster. And we are in an era where players move all the time. And I'm not blaming the Phoenix Suns for going out and acquiring star players, all-star players. Credit to them. I think that that's always something that is going to be tantalizing for these franchises. But it makes me think about the Bucks, and perhaps they had their hands tied behind their backs a little bit this year in terms of what they could do in moving the better players on the roster. But I do think that sometimes we can all get a little bit complacent or maybe overlook this Bucks roster just because it's familiar, just because we've seen it for a number of years. How do you balance the idea of consistency within a franchise for these contending teams? Because what the Bucks are doing is pretty rare. Maybe the Golden State Warriors, but they picked up a couple of titles there when they got one of those superstar players in Kevin Durant. But not too many teams do this, go the old San Antonio Spurs route.
No, it's almost a throwback to like the 90s and the early 2000s, not just for the NBA, but for all sports before we saw a lot more roster turnover. And I know everybody's favorite podcaster, Bill Simmons, talked about this a little bit at the end of the season, but teams, I think the Bucks were one of the teams that he included, but these teams that have kind of been together for a while and you almost get there, but you just can't get over the hump. The Bucks obviously different in that, as we, have talked about now, 2 years ago, almost the day they won an NBA championship, but this is 2 straight off seasons where you look at, well, if Chris was healthy, maybe we beat the Celtics and maybe this team has another championship. I've certainly shared my thoughts that I don't think it was entirely the Giannis injury that was the issue against the Miami Heat, but you can still point to that and say he clearly wasn't 100% and he missed at least half the series. And there's been a number of these teams. I mean, you think about Utah was kind of in the same boat, and obviously they didn't win a title, where they had most of the same roster for year after year after year before finally last year saying it's time to eject here and it's time to change things up. I think the thing that makes the Bucks different is they won the championship. And if this team didn't win 2 years ago, I think everybody would be saying, look, it's not going to work here, that it's time to do something different. And the whole continuity is good. It's kind of a double-edged sword of it's good when you win. And then when you can't get over the hump, it's, well, these guys, it just doesn't work together. So I think the fact that the Bucks had won the title may skewer how you feel one way or another there. I personally think it does matter, and it is important if you are a team that has proven that you can win there. So it's not to say, well, woulda, coulda, shoulda these last 2 years, but it is important to keep most of this group together. And I think what the Bucks have done a good job of doing these last couple of years, and this year it's certainly TBD, is they've kind of stayed the course and they've kept that continuity. It was really the 1 year when they won a title, when, how much time we spent talking about 50% of this roster is new. They came in with 14 guys, 7 of them didn't play on the team the year prior, that was the year of change and it brought you a title. But I think they've done a good job of saying, let's not do full-scale changes here. We still believe in Giannis and Chris and obviously Drew since getting him. We like this group. Let's just do some tinkering on the edges. And that's what they've done the last few years. And that's what they did again this year, although I think you could make a case. It may not seem like it on paper, but this year was a little more full-scale tinkering, not just the Bud move, obviously, but when you look at it's very clear they had a specific and certain type of player in mind in terms of shaping their roster and a youth movement that we've talked about. And they've gone down that path this year while still trying to thread the needle of keeping that continuity and keeping this team together. So long story short, I think it's good. I think it is what the Bucks should be doing. Obviously, as long as you have Giannis too, you have to kind of keep that familiarity and that continuity and keep trying to win. But at the same point, it's almost impossible to do. You got to get younger and you got to kind of get some of those infusions of new blood and just a little bit of tweaking. And John Horst, we don't know how it's going to go yet, but John Horst just tried to do it this year.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned a team like Utah that eventually gave up. But in the Eastern Conference, you've got Boston and Miami and Philadelphia. Those 2 teams, or those 3 teams, have been banging their heads up against the wall just as long as the Bucks have. But the Bucks got a title. Those other teams haven't to this point, despite getting close. And in the case of certainly Miami and Boston actually making it to the NBA Finals, but not being able to get over the hump. So, I do think that part of the difference with the Bucks is that when you look at those teams, Embiid is obviously an MVP now, but a heavy rival of the Bucks, Philadelphia 76ers, it's fair to say. But Giannis the best player out of all those players. So I think that's where the impatience can come. And I think there can also be a frustration no matter how you look at it. You need to have luck to win an NBA title. But when you don't have luck, and then there is health issues that get in the way, there is always the question, and people can lean into saying, well, it's just an excuse. You weren't good enough. You pointed to the Giannis injury this year. The Middleton injury last year is a massive what if, and that's something that you can never fully answer. But it was the year before that we did see this team get over the top and win a title, and maybe there was some injury luck the other way. So I think for the Bucks, it's been a lack of flexibility that has certainly pushed them in this direction as well. Do I think they would have got rid of one of those star players? Probably not. But we do need to look across the rest of the conference and see that there hasn't been other teams getting over the top either. So I think the Bucks are still in a really good place in the Eastern Conference. But after we come back, I want to get to the odds. And then we're going to talk about Adrian Griffin and what actually the Bucks should be trying to prove, the offense or the defense, because I get a lot of comments about the defensive side of the ball. In my opinion, this was a really damn good defensive team in the first place. There's still plenty more to talk about on today's show after I get to PrizePicks, our sponsor of today's show, longtime sponsor of the show as well. And if you aren't fully up to speed with how you can play PrizePicks, you pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. You don't have to compete against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. And if you're sitting there thinking there's no NBA to watch right now, it's totally fine because you can play PrizePicks on baseball, golf, college sports, WNBA. That's something you can get involved in. There's NASCAR, there's tennis, MMA as well. So you can go through the card or the sport or the players, the rosters, whatever it may be for all of those sports. There's still endless options there on PrizePicks. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy and currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. If you deposit 100, PrizePicks will give you 100. Deposit 50, you'll get 50. Don't forget the promo code Locked On at sign up, and you'll get that instant deposit match up to $100. That's at PrizePicks. The odds in the Eastern Conference are fascinating to me, and I look at the win totals, and I've seen various marks for the Bucks, but I see it at around 52.5, and I think we may have discussed this idea a little bit, but I do think even if you're someone that is really excited about the fresh change of having Adrian Griffin in Milwaukee, and I'm on board, I think it's exciting. You come into a new season and you've got optimism, you've got hope, you've got an idea that you might see something exciting and new. I think there is more uncertainty about how this team is going to track, particularly in the early days, if they are trying to implement some new things in what has really been a pretty stable offense and particularly defensive scheme for this team for a number of years. So that 52 wins, I still feel optimistic the Bucks will be over the top. Part of the reason I feel that way, Justin, is just looking at the rest of the East and asking who actually got better in the offseason. Now we sit and we wait and we read the latest rumors when it comes to Damian Lillard and the Miami Heat. It's gone a little bit quiet here over the last week or so, but if I go to FanDuel and look at the Eastern Conference odds for next year, the Boston Celtics plus 200, they're the favorites to get out of the East. We can discuss that in a second. Milwaukee plus 280, second favorites. Miami are there and they're plus 450. And I don't know how much that has to do with last season and getting to the NBA Finals, or the fact that people are anticipating that they might have Damian Lillard on this roster soon. Then you got Philadelphia at plus 650. And then to me, at least, it's a drop off to the Cavs and the Knicks. So as much as we discuss what the Bucks do in an off season, we've always got an eye to the other teams. And you're looking at Boston, you're looking at Philadelphia, and as of currently right now, Miami. Did anyone get better?
I don't think anybody got like markedly better. I think the Knicks got a little better. But you're talking about a team that finished 5th last year, and I mean, you could make a strong case of, hey, it's another year, and they did some tinkering. Now you get a full season with some of the guys that you acquired, namely Josh Hart. You bring in Dante DiVincenzo, so maybe they can improve. But you mentioned Miami. I think a lot of that hinges on a lot of people believe that's where Damian Lillard is going to end up. If that is the case, it's going to be tough to convince me Miami wouldn't finish in the top 4. Cleveland, at the very least, stayed the course. They made some additions as well. Maybe they got a little bit better. But the big ones that you mentioned, obviously, we'll look at the big 3 of the Bucks, the Sixers, and the Celtics. I don't think I'm alone here. I don't think the Celtics got better. I don't think they got dramatically worse, but I think they did get worse with the moves that they made here. And, Philadelphia, it's still kind of what we said with the Dame thing of wait and see. It's wait and see with how this goes. I mean, it certainly does start to feel like James Harden isn't going to be moved.
Who wants him?
Well, that's sure who wants him, or who wants him for the price that Daryl Morey is going to hold out for, I think is the bigger question. But also, we've read this book before. And if James Harden, in fact, does not want to be there, we have seen him in 2 previous destinations take actions into his own hands and route himself out of town. So that is something you have to keep an eye on, that this is James Harden has no problem playing hardball. Daryl Morey has no problem playing hardball either. So we're going to have a game of chicken here between those 2 sides. But to your larger point, you can't really point out one of those teams, at least one of the contending teams, and say, man, they got a lot better. I think of all the teams that made these moves, the Celtics and the Bucks would have the highest ceiling of teams that may have improved themselves, because if you're the Celtics, I know I said I don't think they got better, but you would point to, hey, we think Kristaps Porzingis gives us something that we haven't had before. He gives us another rim protector. I'm not going to say he's a great defender, but he gives us another rim protector and some Al Horford insurance. But his back to the basket game, and he was one of the best offensive players out of the post. We haven't had that in years, obviously, with being a perimeter team. So maybe that pushes us forward. And with the Bucks, obviously, you make the coaching change, you get a little younger, and I think we're all still kind of waiting to see if the Bucks are actually done, as we spend a lot of time talking about the backup point guard spot. So those are the 2 teams you would point to and say, well, in terms of ceiling, I guess they have the highest ceiling for saying who got better, but the conference as a whole, yeah, it wasn't like one team leapfrogged everyone. I think you saw some of the teams that were closer to the bottom come up a little bit. You saw some of those teams that were basically playing tournament teams get a little bit better as well. So I think, to me, you look at the East, and it's still probably the Bucks, the Celtics, and the Sixers, and the Miami Heat, if they get Damian Lillard. Even without him, it'll be interesting to see a full season now. But those teams that were in the middle portion, in the 4, 5, and all the way down to now, in this case, probably 12, those teams got better. So it wasn't really the elite getting better and the upper tier of the conference getting better. It was just the middle.
Yeah, maybe it'll be more challenging through the regular season. Certainly in the early years of the Bud era, it felt like the Bucks could just show up, particularly against the Central Division, and they would not even have to. It was just automatic. It was like a 20-point win anytime they played any of those Central Division teams. Why can't we go back to the good old days of playing the crappy Pistons in the first round of the playoffs? Why do we have to deal with Miami this year? But we know firsthand from Miami in the first round of this series, and then I was covering them in person towards the back end of the postseason, and in the finals, no Vincent, no Strus. Obviously, 2 guys that had big moments. And Boston, it's still going to be really strange for me to watch this team without Marcus Smart and Grant Williams. I still haven't been able to wrap my head around that. But you remember there was this idea that the Eastern Conference, or certainly the top end of the Eastern Conference, had surpassed the Western Conference. I think that was a very fleeting idea, because as I look at the odds on FanDuel for the Western Conference, you've got Denver, you've got Phoenix, Golden State. The Lakers had a pretty solid offseason, I would say, even though LeBron continues to get a little bit older. Then you've got the Clippers and the Mavericks. Now, Dallas, a little bit on the outside. Maybe Luka and Kyrie first season together, maybe they are able to make steps, but there is no question the Western Conference is deeper and significantly better, because that's not even talking about teams that are going to continue to rise, like the Pelicans, if they can stay healthy. The Oklahoma City Thunder, still super young, but they took some steps last year. Minnesota, keep going down the list.
Yeah, I wasn't an ad-free subscriber, but I did subscribe to that theory very briefly, a year or 2 ago, despite our pal Ben Golliver really trying to sway me in the other direction and really rooting his Western Conference allegiance. And it's proven to be true. And it was really leading into the playoffs last year, where you saw and you slowly started to realize, yeah, those 3 teams at the top of the East, and even that has kind of been debunked a little, but going into the playoffs, I think we all thought, well, the more we get a look at this, it's really just the top 3 teams in the East are really good. The Western Conference overall, maybe you can say, and again, the championship came from the West, but maybe you could say, hey, none of these teams are as good as Milwaukee or Boston, but the whole conference, when you stack up 1 through 15, it's certainly better than the Eastern Conference 1 through 15. And I think as we touched on, teams not necessarily taking a huge leap in the East this year, I think teams in the West obviously got better, similar to what we said about the East, but in the Western Conference, even more so with those teams that were lower and in the middle tier. I mean, There's no telling what Victor Wembanyama is going to do this year and what that'll mean for San Antonio. I'm not going to say that they're a playoff team or competing for a championship, but even a team like Houston maybe could be like Oklahoma City was last year, where they've added some veterans and they're going to try to win. So now when you look at the Western Conference, can you find a team that's not going to be trying to be competitive? It's kind of shifted back to the East.
Let us know in the YouTube comments how you feel. Who's the biggest threat to the Bucks in the Eastern Conference? And I don't think we need to ask the East versus West question. If you're trying to tell me the East is better, I'm not having it. I'm not listening to that argument. All right, we want to get back to the Milwaukee Bucks specifically here, though. Adrian Griffin coming on board. We're going to talk a little bit of defense versus offense next. One thing I have noticed, Justin, is as I listen to various podcasts, and there's been a bunch out there over the last few weeks that are kind of wrapping up the free agency period now that everything is closed down. And I understand it from a player personnel perspective. The Bucks largely run it back. You bring back Middleton, Lopez, Crowder, go down the list. But I don't think that you can fully sit here and say the Bucks have just decided that they're just coming back completely when you change head coach and you part ways with a championship-winning head coach. Now, we've spoken about the uncertainty of perhaps what might lie ahead for the Bucks. We've discussed the idea of Adrian Griffin talking about the defense and energy and being aggressive and trying to force turnovers and those types of things. That's a little bit different to the way the Bucks used to play. But I do get a few comments in the YouTube chat where Bucks fans are saying, well, they went to the draft, they've brought in athleticism, they've brought in defense. I know the Bucks are aging. The defense has just been something that I've never been worried about this team. And I know they got cooked in the first round. We all watched it. It was disastrous. But I didn't think that overall would be a problem for this team if they were fully healthy. That's a big if. You have to get younger. You have to get more athletic. But I've still got more questions on the offensive side of the ball. And I do think that if the Bucks change things up a little bit defensively, there might be some growing pains that could cause some frustration among the fans. We talk about how stable they were, protecting the paint better than any team in the league. Last year cut down a little bit on the three-point shot as well. But if the Bucks are going to be more aggressive, if they're going to look to force more turnovers, it might open up the paint a little bit. It might send teams to the free throw line a little bit more than what they used to do, and certainly not fouling was a high priority for Bud. So I think the idea of defense versus offense is interesting. I think the Bucks clearly need to take steps and try some different things in the half-court offense. But making changes to the defense is going to be fascinating as well to me. And as I mentioned, I can at least envisage through the first half of the season, hopefully that's it, some growing pains for this team.
Yeah, I can see that. I think the unique thing, so I think this might be like the year they won the title and not necessarily the end result, although that would be great. But you know, remember, that year was, we talked about the roster changes and half of that roster was new. There were a lot of low points during the regular season, some very, very low points. I mean, think about that weekend against in Charlotte and then I believe Houston, the back-to-back games where the Bucks gave up, I think, 53s in those two games. And it was our old pal Eric Bledsoe in New Orleans and Charlotte, our old pal Eric Bledsoe doing them in. There were a lot of those types of games. There was a game in Houston later on in the season where that was the 50-point game from Kevin Porter Jr. So there were a lot of those moments. And even earlier in the season when the team just didn't really look like they were on the same page a lot of times defensively. And, we remember early Drew Holiday kind of going to Bud and being the loudest advocate for, hey, we got to do things differently and we got to switch. And, he even gave an interview, I think it was to our pal Eric, talking about after the Mavs game or the Jazz game where Utah, again, came into Milwaukee and hit 20-plus threes early in that season. And Drew had said, I kind of voiced to Bud, I've played this team a lot in the Western Conference and the Mavs and teams like that, and we got to defend them differently. And it took a little bit of time, but we saw Bud kind of adjust and the Bucks do things differently defensively and all across the board, really offensively as well. But it took time, and there are a lot of low points in the regular season. I think you're going to see some similar things. I think there's certainly going to be some growing pains because I would anticipate it's not going to be a standard drop defense. I would anticipate the offense is going to be wildly different from what we've seen. Adrian Griffin has already hinted at it's not going to be let it fly. Not to say we won't shoot threes, but it's going to be good threes and better threes. So I think you're going to have those moments where you look up and you think, man, how did this team lose to the Hornets by 17 or what's going on here? Although I don't think it's going to be quite as extreme, and maybe this is just hopeful here, but because the Bucks are in a unique position because of that chemistry and that continuity that we touched on at the top of the show, and it's a very veteran team that you have very good individual defenders. As we've seen, if you defend, you're at least going to be competitive, and that's going to offset a lot of things. So even as the Bucks are kind of navigating a new offense, and even if they're not necessarily on the same page with some new principles and schemes that they're running defensively, you still have Drew Holiday. You still have Giannis. You still have the rim protection and Brook Lopez. That's going to make up for a lot of things. So that should kind of offset some of those growing pains, but I don't think it's going to be like what we saw the first 2 years of Bud, where it was just kind of you showed up to the arena assuming the Bucks were going to win, certainly a home game. And if they were playing a team that was 500 or worse, you could also kind of mark that down as a win. I don't think it's going to be like that. I don't think it's going to be quite as severe as some of those low points in the regular season 2 years ago. But I think it's going to be kind of a bumpy process, at least the first 2 or 3 months of this season.
Yeah, and I guess that's the reason why I've had these thoughts myself as well, because if you were someone who was anti-Bud, who again was not us, much to the frustration of some Bucks fans, but if you are of the opinion that, well, you just change your coach and now the Bucks are going to be fine, I would caution against that. You referenced the 2021 season, and I remember having conversations on this show throughout that season saying, okay, this isn't working, but you have to force your way through those difficult stretches. You can't just immediately revert back to what you know works, because ultimately the 82 games that you've got, maybe you win a little in-season tournament on the way, NBA Cup champions. Everyone will be excited about that. But that's preparing yourself for the postseason, because as we've learned over the course of the last few years, doing the same thing over and over doesn't necessarily work in a 7-game series when you're playing the best players and the best teams at home or on the road. And the Bucks have gone through that. So, yes, I'm curious to know what the roller coaster looks like for this team going forward this season, but it's also exciting. And I think for the most part, it'll take some patience, certainly in the locker room, but certainly with the fans as well. This is just something that we haven't seen for over 5 years, which I think everyone can get excited about. And the offense, we've pointed to some of the guys they've obviously added, but for the most part, we expect it's going to be much of the same characters. So it'll be interesting to see when you reference the three-point shot. The volume of threes in Summer League was obviously pretty low, but they didn't have too many shooters on the floor outside of Craig Randall when he came on in the final game. So I think that will probably change a little bit. I'm not sure with some of the personnel on the roster, they'll be able to tone that all the way back. I also don't think they need to, but some of the shot selection is going to be fascinating to watch for this team, I think, moving forward. But let us know what you think about the defense versus offense for this Bucks team moving forward. What are you most excited about or most concerned about? I think that might be the more important question here. Justin, you know, we had a chat before this show and we said, we don't know what we're going to talk about, but here we are half an hour later. We always find a way. There's nonstop topics to talk about with the Milwaukee Bucks, but it's midnight over there. Get some rest, my friend.
Nonstop topics. Sooner or later, that's going to run out. You know, certainly not anytime soon, but sooner or later, it's actually going to feel like the off season.
I hope not. I might have to retire if it gets to that point. But we will be back over the next few days for sure. Locked On Bucks continues to roll on through the offseason. Drop your topic ideas in the YouTube comments, and we'll try to get some different voices and some different guests on this show as we do roll through the dead period of the offseason and the lead up to the FIBA World Cup through the middle and late of next August. Hopefully, a couple of Bucks players involved there. So still enough basketball to discuss. Like I said, get to Cooperage Friday night. Game 6, relive the glory days of the Bucks winning an NBA championship. And until then, we'll see you next time.